All right, welcome back to the deep dive.
Yeah, glad to be back.
So today we're going to dive into something that, at first glance might seem kind of niche,
Right.
foot binding in China and Taiwan, but
Yeah. Yeah.
but, trust us on this one.
There's some really big takeaways here.
Yeah, we're going to unearth some stuff about how societies change and evolve that we can apply more broadly.
Absolutely. And we're going to do that by looking at how the economy really played a key role in the decline of this practice that had been going on for centuries.
Right, and for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with what foot binding was, it was this process of really tightly wrapping young girls' feet and reshaping them, and it led to these permanent deformities.
Yeah, incredibly painful process.
Right, really, really limited their movement.
Yeah.
So, you'd think something like that would be based purely on, social custom, like it's just what people did. But our deep dive today is into some research from the Journal of Development Economics, and it's revealing this fascinating connection between the economy and, social change.
Yeah, it's not just what people did, it's how the economy kind of shifted things around in the early 20th century in Taiwan and actually ended up playing a major role in the decline of foot binding.
Right, and that's what I think is going to be interesting to everyone listening is that, we can see how these seemingly unrelated economic factors can have these huge effects on really deeply entrenched social norms.
For sure. Get ready to kind of shift your perspective on how societies change.
Yeah, so we're going to see some surprising insights here today. So today our focus is very, very specific. We're going to look at the connection between the sugarcane industry in Taiwan and the decline of foot binding.
That's right. And we've got some newly discovered Taiwanese data from the early 20th century that we're diving into.
So, okay, let's unpack this a little bit. Foot binding. This is a practice that was around for centuries, and it was, very deeply woven into the fabric of society. I mean, you'd think, gender norms like this would be incredibly difficult to change.
Right. They're so deeply rooted.
Yeah, and we all know how persistent gender gaps can be. We see it even in places that we think of as very progressive.
Absolutely. And research shows us that these norms, they really have this powerful way of influencing, behavior and opportunities. Even among, female MBA students, even among, medical doctors.
Wow.
And in societies that really, put gender equality on a pedestal.
Right, that think that
you still see these gaps.
Yeah.
It's just, it highlights how sticky these norms can be.
Yeah, so considering all of that, how difficult it is to shift these deeply ingrained norms, the fact that foot binding disappeared relatively quickly in Taiwan is even more intriguing.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't just this slow fade. It was like a pretty dramatic shift.
Exactly. And to kind of set the stage a little bit before the 20th century, foot binding was incredibly widespread among a particular group of women in Taiwan, the Hoklo women.
Okay.
And we're talking, around 68% in 1905. But the interesting thing is it was really uncommon among Hakka women.
Okay.
Only about 0.75% in the same year.
Yeah.
So, even within Taiwan, you see this difference in how norms can be really specific to certain groups.
Right. So the Japanese took control of Taiwan in 1895, and they started trying to discourage foot binding. What did those initial efforts look like?
Well, the Japanese colonial government tried a number of things.
Okay.
They launched public health campaigns. They were using newspapers and magazines highlighting the downsides of foot binding.
Okay.
They had health professionals, intellectuals visiting schools, talking about the benefits of natural foot growth. They even supported organizations like the Natural Foot Society.
So it sounds like they were tackling it from a bunch of different angles.
Right.
But the research mentions that they had kind of limited success getting women to actually unbind their feet.
Yeah.
Why was that?
That's a really important point. While these early campaigns, they probably did reduce the number of new cases of foot binding.
Oh, okay.
And we see that in the 1905 census data.
Yeah.
Where younger women had lower rates compared to older women. Convincing women who'd already gone through the process to actually unbind their feet, that was a whole other challenge.
Right.
Unbinding was painful. The recovery was difficult, even though ultimately it could improve their mobility and strength. For a lot of women, the immediate pain and effort.
Right.
It didn't seem worth it at the time.
Yeah, it wasn't worth going through all of that.
Exactly. There's this like disutility factor.
Right.
It's just unpleasant.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. But then the research points to this huge change that happened after 1905. The number of women who had been bound and then unbound their feet, it jumped from less than 1% to over 63% in just 10 years.
Wow.
And by 1920, after foot binding was outlawed in 1915, it was down to just 11%.
That's huge.
Yeah, I mean, that is a massive shift in a very short period of time. So the big question is what happened?
That's the million-dollar question right there.
Yeah.
And you know what the research really points to is that it was a major economic development.
Okay.
That happened right around the same time. And that was the really rapid growth of the sugarcane industry in Taiwan.
Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit. You know, what was agriculture like in Taiwan before the sugarcane boom happened?
So before the Japanese really came in and started to change things, agriculture in Taiwan was really mostly about growing rice.
Okay.
Sugarcane was pretty rare. It was taking up less than 4% of the farmland in 1905. And the way that they processed the raw sugar was very traditional. It was done in these small mills, family-run, often powered by animals.
So a very different picture from what was to come.
Right, completely different.
So how did the Japanese change things?
Well, you know, the Japanese colonial government, they had this very clear goal.
Oh, yeah.
They wanted Taiwan to be a major sugar supplier for Japan.
Cool.
So they wouldn't have to rely on imports as much. And to do that, they really promoted a modern sugar industry.
Okay.
And what that meant was, you know, building these large factories, mechanized, you run it on electricity.
Wow.
And these weren't just, you know, local efforts. These were funded by big companies from Japan.
Okay.
Offered with government support.
So this really led to like a rapid expansion of sugarcane farming.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The years after 1905, you just see this huge increase in the number of these modern factories and the amount of land that was dedicated to growing sugarcane.
Right.
And the government, they also set up this system where each factory had a specific local area.
Okay.
Where they were basically the main buyer for sugarcane. And this combined with contracts where the companies guaranteed prices to the farmers, it gave the farmers a very strong incentive to switch to growing cane.
So they were really encouraged to grow the sugarcane.
Yes, definitely.
Can you give us an idea of just how much it grew, like in terms of numbers?
Yeah, the numbers are pretty remarkable.
Okay.
Between 1903 and 1918, the total amount of sugarcane that was produced each year increased almost 20-fold.
Wow.
And the land that was used for growing sugarcane, it increased 9-fold.
Wow, that's incredible.
From around 16,500 to over 150,000 of this local land unit called a JDE. So it was really this huge agricultural transformation.
Yeah, yeah. So we have this booming sugarcane industry now. How does that connect to women unbinding their feet?
Right, that's the key question.
Yeah, what's the crucial link?
The crucial link has to do with labor.
Okay.
You know, unlike rice farming. Growing sugarcane required a lot more labor in general, but much more importantly, it needed a higher proportion of female labor.
Ah, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Can you give us some specific comparisons, like just to illustrate that point?
Yeah, so there's data from a 1919 agricultural survey.
Okay.
That really paints a clear picture.
Okay.
If you look at the same amount of land, one JDE rice farming would take about 15.8 days of female labor, and that was only about 14% of the total work.
Okay.
But to grow sugarcane on that same amount of land, it took 78.9 days.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
Of female labor.
Yeah.
Making up over 36% of the total work. So, you know, it's not just the total amount of work, it's also the proportion of the total that made female labor so important for sugarcane.
Right. So what kinds of tasks were women typically doing in sugarcane production?
So women were really involved in several important tasks that supported the work that the men were doing. You know, they were often the ones who were in charge of planting the sugarcane cuttings, weeding the fields to keep those young plants healthy, and stripping the dry leaves from the mature sugarcane stalks.
So these are all tasks that, you know, maybe don't require as much brute strength as some of the other tasks.
Exactly. It's lighter work, but it's absolutely essential.
Oh, right.
You know, men, they were usually the ones who did the heavier work, you know, the digging and preparing the fields, packing and carrying materials and actually cutting down the mature sugarcane.
Right. So with this big increase in the need for female labor, you know, how is that met? Did families just have to work more hours?
Well, that was probably part of it. Women in farming families probably did work more hours in the fields.
Right.
But the increased demand, it also meant that they were hiring more part-time female workers.
Okay.
So this growth of the sugarcane industry, it really expanded the role of women in agricultural production.
So I'm starting to see the connection here. If there's this high demand for female labor, how does having bound feet become a problem?
Exactly. Yeah. Because foot binding, it really limited a woman's ability to move freely.
Right.
And reduced her physical strength. And in an economy that's increasingly relying on women's labor to do things like, plant and weed sugarcane women with bound feet,
yeah,
they would have been at a huge disadvantage.
Right.
They would have been much less efficient, much less able to participate in this growing industry.
Right.
The need for their labor,
yeah,
it essentially made foot binding a lot more costly because you're missing out on these economic opportunities.
Right. It's like that opportunity cost of having bound feet.
Exactly.
So women who unbound their feet could now earn more or, contribute more to their families by working in the sugarcane field.
Precisely. And that's what the research suggests. This economic incentive was a major driving force behind that surge in unbinding after 1905.
Right.
The advantages of having unbound feet, being able to move more easily, do the agricultural work.
Yeah.
It outweighed the pain and the difficulty of the unbinding process for a lot of women.
Right. So now the research uses this interesting concept of an instrumental variable, and they use this thing called cane railroads.
Yes.
Can you explain what those are and why they're important for showing a direct cause and effect relationship?
Sure. So cane railroads, these were these privately owned narrow gauge railway lines that were built specifically for transporting sugar cane from the fields to the processing factories.
Okay.
And they're important because their construction was so directly tied to the growth of the sugar industry.
Mm-hmm.
And the researchers, they argue that these railroads act as this strong instrument.
Okay.
Because, where they were built, it really influenced how much sugar cane was grown in a certain region.
Right.
But the railroads themselves, they were unlikely to directly affect people's decisions about foot binding, for reasons other than their impact on the sugarcane farming.
Okay.
So it's like a way to isolate the effect of the sugarcane.
Right.
Unbinding.
So it's a way to really pinpoint the impact of the sugarcane, but how do they make sure that these railroads weren't just, built in areas where people were already more open to abandoning foot binding?
Yeah, so that's a really crucial question when you're doing this kind of analysis.
Yeah.
So the researchers looked at whether those initial rates of foot binding in 1905, they looked at whether those predicted where the cane railroads were later built.
Okay.
And what they found was that initial rate of foot binding didn't really predict where the railroads ended up being.
Interesting.
Instead, the things that really seemed to determine where railroads were built were things like the natural terrain.
Okay.
Was it suitable for laying tracks? Was the land itself good for growing sugarcane?
Right.
And was it near a river? Because that's where the factories were often located.
Okay.
So it really seems like the railroads primarily influenced foot binding through their effect on sugarcane cultivation.
Okay.
And not because of, pre-existing social attitudes.
Right. So what did their actual statistical analysis show when they looked at the impact of sugarcane farming using these cane railroads as their instrument?
So the analysis in these different methods, it consistently showed a strong and statistically significant effect.
Okay.
Their preferred estimate suggests that in areas where the proportion of land used for sugarcane farming increased by a significant amount, you saw this dramatic rise, almost 19 percentage points.
Wow.
In the number of women who had unbound their feet by 1915.
Okay, and what about the women who kept their feet bound?
So they found a corresponding decrease.
Okay.
So in those same areas with more sugarcane farming, their analysis suggests about a 12.8 percentage point drop in the proportion of women who still had bound feet by 1915.
So those are both huge effects.
Yeah, very large effects. And those findings, they held up even when they used slightly different statistical approaches and even when they excluded the more remote areas.
So it sounds like they were really thorough in their analysis.
Yes, definitely.
And it really seems like, the growth of sugarcane had this major impact. Did they find any other evidence that supports this connection?
Yes. So they looked at a number of other things.
Okay.
They saw a clear geographical pattern. So the areas in central and southern Taiwan where you saw the biggest increases in sugarcane farming.
Yeah.
those were also the areas that saw the biggest increases in women unbinding their feet.
Right.
They also noticed that younger women, so women between the ages of 21 and 50, they were more likely to unbind their feet.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, which makes sense, right? Because they have more years of potential work ahead of them.
Right, right.
Where being mobile would be a real advantage.
Yeah, exactly.
And they also found that women in farming jobs, especially in those sugarcane growing regions, they were more likely to unbind compared to women who had non-agricultural jobs. And then finally, they did some back-of-the-envelope calculations that showed just how much the demand for female labor increased.
Right.
Because of sugarcane, highlighting just how many women were needed for this work.
Right, right. So the economic incentive seems pretty clear. But the research also looks at, why this economic shift actually led to the social change.
Right.
And they considered a couple of possible explanations.
Yeah, there's a couple of main ideas that they looked at.
Yeah.
The first was that, maybe women gained more power within their households.
Okay.
If they were earning more or contributing more to the family income through sugarcane work, maybe they had more say in decisions like whether or not to unbind their feet.
Right. More economic power could lead to more independence in making personal choices.
Exactly.
What did the evidence show for that?
Well, interestingly, the evidence didn't really strongly support that idea as the main driver. They found that, the growth in sugarcane farming, it led to similar improvements in the survival rates of both boys and girls.
Okay.
And it didn't really change the ratio of male to female children. If women had gained this significant bargaining power and were, prioritizing their daughter's well-being more,
right,
you might expect to see, bigger improvements in outcomes for girls compared to boys.
Okay, so maybe it wasn't primarily about women having more say at home.
Right.
So what was the other explanation that they looked at?
The other explanation had to do with what economists call human capital.
Okay.
The idea was that unbinding became a valuable investment in a woman's physical abilities, making them more productive in this, high-demand agricultural work
right.
of sugarcane cultivation.
Okay, and was there more evidence for that explanation?
So there was some suggestive evidence. They found this geographical link between the growth in sugarcane farming and improvements in the survival rates of young girls, which suggests that, maybe parents were more inclined to invest in the health of their daughters if they knew that their labor was going to be more valuable later on.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But they also noted that, the effect of sugarcane farming on literacy rates for both boys and girls, it was really minimal and not statistically significant.
Okay.
Which suggests that the main impact here was really on physical abilities rather than, formal education in this context.
So it seems like, the need for physical labor in the sugarcane fields was really a stronger driving force.
Right. That's the conclusion that the researchers seem to be leaning towards.
Okay.
They see foot binding as this, costly social norm that persisted because of, social pressure.
Right.
And maybe, advantages in the marriage market.
Okay.
And the economic opportunities that were created by the sugarcane boom.
Right.
They seem to have changed that calculation for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Making unbinding more appealing and potentially, even leading to a tipping point where the norm just started to disappear rapidly.
Right.
And they even point to data suggesting that the proportion of the Hakka population.
Okay.
Remember, they didn't practice foot binding.
Right.
They might have actually played a role in this tipping dynamic.
Interesting. So to sum it all up, this deep dive into Taiwanese history, it shows us that the rapid growth of the sugarcane industry in the early 20th century, it gave women this strong economic reason to abandon foot binding.
Yeah, it wasn't just social campaigns.
Right.
It was really about these economic opportunities. That arose.
It really makes you think, though.
It does.
While foot binding is a practice from the past, what contemporary costly norms might be susceptible to change if economic incentives shifted.
Right. Are there other things out there
that
we just haven't thought about?
Yeah. I mean, think about, other harmful gender-specific customs that still exist today, like female genital mutilation. You know, could similar economic shifts that increase the demand for female labor, could those play a role in the decline of these practices, as the study suggests?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question.
Yeah, and it's a powerful reminder that economic forces can be this surprisingly strong catalyst for social transformation.
Absolutely. We encourage you to think about other examples in history where economic changes led to social transformation.
Yeah.
And look into the ongoing efforts to address harmful social norms.
Right. Yeah.
There's always more to discover when we take a deep dive.
That's right. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.